The city that never sleeps had a particular cruelty about it on the night of October 14th, and New York did not pause for heartbreak as Sophia Thorne, 7 months pregnant, stood in the marble-floored study of the family's Beekman Place penthouse at 2:47 a.m., holding a document she had never been meant to find. She was dressed in a cream silk robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her left hand instinctively pressed flat against the swell of her stomach as though shielding the child inside from what her eyes were reading. The document was a wire transfer confirmation, $430,000, moved from the Thorne Baby Trust, a fund her father-in-law, Edward Thorne Sr., had personally established for his unborn grandchild, into an account registered under a Delaware shell company called Luminex Hospitality Consulting LLC. It had taken Sophia 11 minutes and a single Google search to discover that Luminex Hospitality Consulting LLC had one known associated contact, a woman named Chloe Bennett, 29 years old, a self-described luxury brand strategist based out of a Tribeca loft that, as Sophia would later confirm, had been quietly co-leased by her husband Marcus Thorne for the past 14 months. She did not scream. She did not shatter the crystal decanter on the shelf beside her. She sat down in Marcus's leather chair, the same chair from which he ran Thorne Legacy Group, a third-generation hospitality empire worth an estimated $340 million, comprising 4 boutique hotels across New York, 1 in Charleston, and a majority stake in a historic Hudson Valley estate, and she sat very, very still. Later, those who knew her would say that was the moment the real Sophia Thorne was born, not the Sophia who had quietly abandoned her law career 3 years earlier at Marcus's gentle insistence. Not the Sophia who had hosted charity galas at the Thorne Grand on Park Avenue in floor-length gowns and pearl earrings, smiled at photographers, and answered questions about nursery colors. The woman who rose from that leather chair was something the betrayal had accidentally forged, precise, patient, and absolutely without mercy. For the next 28 days, Sophia Thorne gave the performance of her life, wearing it like a second skin, the dutiful wife, the glowing expectant mother, the woman who noticed nothing and suspected even less. On the morning of October 15th, she appeared at the breakfast table in a sage green maternity dress, her hair pinned neatly, pouring Marcus his coffee with the same quiet grace she always had. Marcus Thorne, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in his standard charcoal Brioni suit, his cologne filling the kitchen the way his ego filled every room, kissed her forehead, asked how she had slept, checked his phone 3 times before his espresso cooled, and left. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, Sophia picked up her personal cell phone, not the one Marcus paid for, and called Edward Thorne Sr. The old man was 71 years old, and he had built the first Thorne Hotel with borrowed money and his own hands in 1978. And he was a man who understood in the marrow of his bones what loyalty meant and what its violation cost. He listened to his daughter-in-law's voice without interrupting, and when she finished speaking, there was a long silence, and then he said quietly, "Tell me what you need." He had already suspected. He had seen the trust fund withdrawals on the quarterly statement and had not wanted to believe his son capable of stealing from an unborn child. But now he no longer had to wonder. By noon of that same Tuesday, Edward Sr. had placed a call to Margaret Holloway, the Thorne family's longtime estate attorney, a 64-year-old Columbia Law graduate who operated from a discreet brownstone office on East 70th Street and who had over 30 years handled every sensitive legal matter the Thorne family had ever needed, buried, or weaponized. And what followed was 4 weeks of extraordinary legal architecture conducted in absolute secrecy, while Sophia continued, without a single crack in her composure, to be the perfect wife. She attended Marcus's hotel board dinner at the Thorne Grand on October 22nd in a midnight blue maternity gown, toasted investors, danced one slow song with her husband under the chandelier light, and touched his arm at all the right moments. She accompanied him to his cousin's engagement party in Greenwich on November 1st, wearing a camel wrap dress and ankle boots, laughing on cue at his stories. She packed him a bag when he announced a conference in Chicago, which she already knew was 3 days in a suite at the Thompson Hotel with Chloe Bennett, because she had American Express alerts forwarded to a secondary email Marcus had long forgotten she could access, and she folded his favorite grey cashmere sweater with care, wished him safe travels, closed the front door, and then drove herself in a hired car down to Margaret Holloway's brownstone office on East 70th Street, where she and Edward Sr. spent 4 hours reviewing documents across a mahogany conference table, while Sophia drank herbal tea and signed her name wherever Margaret placed the tab. Working under Edward Sr.'s quiet authority as the family trust's majority shareholder, Margaret had executed a full legal restructuring of Thorne Legacy Group's ownership architecture because Marcus's shares, which he had always believed were untouchable and protected under a corporate agreement his own father had drafted, were in fact subject to a buyout clause that Edward Sr. had never removed, and he exercised it, legally, completely, transferring controlling interest into a holding entity that named Sophia as primary beneficiary, effective immediately upon the dissolution of the marriage. The Beekman Place penthouse, purchased in Sophia's name 3 years earlier for tax structuring purposes at his own accountant's suggestion, was hers outright. The Hudson Valley estate went with the trust. The legal fees for the recovery of the baby trust funds were attached as a civil claim directly to Marcus's personal accounts. The divorce petition was filed on November 12th at 9:03 a.m. in the New York County Supreme Court, Matrimonial Division, and Sophia was wearing a structured burgundy coat over a black turtleneck, her dark hair down, her hands without a single tremor as she stepped out of Margaret's office and into the cold autumn air of the Upper East Side. Marcus was served at 11:15 a.m. That same morning in the lobby of the Thorne Grand on Park Avenue, in front of 2 hotel managers and a concierge named Paolo, who had worked there for 11 years. And he stood, very still, read the documents, read them again, and called his attorney, who told him something he had never once in his life prepared to hear, that there was almost nothing left to contest. Chloe Bennett learned what had happened that same afternoon. She had been waiting for Marcus at the Tribeca loft in a cream slip dress, with a bottle of Whispering Angel open on the kitchen counter, and by 4 p.m. his calls had stopped coming, and by 6 p.m. she had seen the New York Post's digital sidebar reporting that Thorne Legacy Group had been restructured and the founder's son removed from the board, and by 7 p.m. she understood in the full and devastating architecture of it that she had been the instrument of a man's self-destruction, and that there was no empire waiting for her on the other side, only an apartment that had stopped being paid for, a man who had nothing left to offer, and the particular, airless loneliness of having burned your own dignity for someone else's marriage. She sat on the kitchen floor of that loft in her cream slip dress, the wine untouched on the counter above her, and she wept for a very long time. Not for Sophia, and not even truly for Marcus, but for herself, for the version of her that had believed the version of him he had so carefully performed. She had been deceived too. It simply cost her less, and it was far less interesting to anyone watching. On January 3rd, in a private suite at Lenox Hill Hospital on the Upper East Side, Sophia Thorne gave birth to a daughter and named her Eleanor Rose, and Edward Sr. was in the waiting room, in a dark wool blazer, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes red, and when the nurse came to tell him his granddaughter had arrived, he stood slowly, walked in, and Sophia placed the baby in his arms, and the old man held her the way men hold the things they almost lost. Marcus did not come. He had not been invited. He was by then in a sublet studio apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, across the river from the empire his grandfather had built and his father had preserved, and that he had quietly liquidated for 14 months of illusion. And on quiet evenings he stood at his window with the Manhattan skyline cold and glittering across the water, and understood, finally and completely, the difference between what he had possessed and what he had actually deserved. Sophia built a new board. She rehired 3 executives Marcus had dismissed without cause. She kept Paolo at the front desk of the Thorne Grand. She wore a charcoal trouser suit to her first board meeting as principal shareholder and placed Eleanor's photograph on the conference table in front of her, and did not smile for the cameras when they came, because she had spent 28 days performing and she had nothing left to perform, and the empire was hers, and the child was hers. And the silence she carried into that room was not emptiness, it was the particular, unshakable calm of a woman who had been underestimated by the one person who should have known better, and had made him pay for it in the only currency that had ever truly mattered to him.